Good evening. My name is Sonia Lee. I teach Asian art history at USC, and I also direct the East Asian Studies Center at the university. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our very special event today. It is part of a series of events that we have organized in conjunction with the exhibition, The Silk Road, Connecting Communities, Markets, and Minds Since Antiquity, which will be on view starting tomorrow in the Doheny Memorial Library at USC. This exhibition will continue through May 31st. I have worked with a number of colleagues at USC to put this exhibition together in the last 2 years, and it has not been easy during a global pandemic. So I'm very happy that it's finally happening. And more importantly, we could actually do this in person. So I'm really grateful to all the people involved in this endeavor. So for today's event, we are very fortunate to have Tan Sensang as our speaker. As many of you in the audience know, he is one of the world's leading authorities on China-India relations in pre-modern times. So for today's event, he will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And because I organize this talk with my course in mind, it's on material culture of the Silk Road. So my students will ask questions first, so they get the first step, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for the rest of the Q&A. Okay, so let me now introduce you to Professor Tan Sensang. He is Professor of History, Director of Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai, and also the Global Network Professor at NYU in New York. He received his MA in Peking University and a PhD from University of Pennsylvania. He has published widely on the subject of India-China relations. His first book, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, The Realignment of Sino-Indian Relations, 600 to 1400, published in 2003, has been a really important work by my own research on the material culture of the Silk Road. He's also the author of India, China, and the World, A Connected History from 2017, which my students are currently reading for the course. And he has also co-authored with Victor Mayer, Traditional China in Asian and World History, 2012. He has edited Buddhism Across Asia, Networks of Material, Cultural, Intellectual Exchange, 2014. And he has co-edited Traveling Past, The Politics of Cultural Heritage in the Indian Ocean World, 2019. And most recently, Beyond Pan-Asianism, Connecting China, India, 1840s to 1960s, 2021. Now, currently, he is writing a book on Zheng He's maritime expeditions in the early 15th century, and several other projects. So without further ado, let me welcome Professor Tan Sensang.
Thank you, Sonia, for inviting me, and thank you to your team, Grace and others who organized the technical part of this event. And I would like to also thank your students for reading the book and also participating today in my talk. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation and wait for your students to join in with regard to Q&A about the presentation today and anything that they have read in the book. So this, when Sonia invited me to give a talk, I was actually working on the 1950s. I'm actually currently working on the 1950s, looking at some of the items, things that were produced during that time between China and India, time usually called the period of friendship between China and India. So I've been looking at various kinds of objects that were produced at that time. So I thought I should revisit some of the things that I've been writing on with regard to the earlier phase of the exchanges between China and India. One of the things that is crucial to link the 50s to the earlier period that I'm going to talk about is this photograph, which is quite fascinating. This is the current Dalai Lama presenting a bone of Xuanzang to the then Prime Minister of India, Nehru. And so this is, I would say, a connection, a material connection through the bone between the 1950s and the 7th century when Xuanzang visited India at that time. So I've talked a little bit about it, but I'll be focusing on the 7th century in particular, and come back to this image about Xuanzang in a different material form returning to India. Now, the reason I was interested in the syllabus that Sonia shared with me and the course that you are teaching, Sonia, is this the issue of materiality that has influenced me in the past several decades, starting with my first book. And so I wanted to look at the method of using it, especially with India, China as the case study. So, and a number of anthropologists have written about it, and I've been influenced by them. I'll mention a few of them. And during the Q&A session, if some of the students are interested, I'll be happy to talk about the methods part as well. Now, it's one of the things, looking through objects or things, is to understand the entanglement between humans and things. I think that's an important way of looking at that humans interact with things throughout the history, and especially in the case of China, India. Very little has been done on looking at that entanglement. Now, the other thing that many anthropologists have talked about is the agency of objects or things imbued with agency, and that, I think, offers a very interesting perspective of the long durée connections between China and India, and that's something I've been working on. Now, things also are reflective of social systems, periods of history, not only when they were created, but as they were transmitted, or various kinds of events as well. So things give us perception of different kinds of social, historical, or various kinds of events that may have taken place. Things, I would argue, are also the reasons why places get connected. They facilitate the transmission of ideas and promote economic exchanges. So perhaps moving from the human agency to the object or thing agency, I think offers a new ways of looking at connections between China and India, and that's what I'm doing for the 1950s and the earlier period as well. Now, this talk deals specifically on long distance travel. Now, with regard to that, things are required to facilitate travel, and I'm thinking about things like water or food. I mean, these are the basic things that you have to travel long distance. We are not traveling that much during the COVID times, but let me tell you, if you come to China, you have to prepare things for your 21 days of quarantine, food, towels, and many other things. But things are carried as needs, gifts, mementos, and we'll see this with regard to the monks that I'm going to talk about. Travel itself can be a thing, and this is, I think, I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Travelogues, just not perhaps things that we do research with, but things we do research on is also quite important. And I'll also point out how, in particular, Xuanzang's travelogue becomes a thing later on. Travelers themselves can become thing, and the picture of Xuanzang bone, I think, is perhaps an evidence of that, how travelers from human become things of worship with his relic. So these are some of the methodological issues that I wanted to emphasize and go on to again point out, if you are interested in some of these conceptual methodological issues, starting, of course, with Arjun Akudurai's edited volume that everybody cites, a bit outdated now, The Social Life of Things. I've been particularly influenced by Ian Hodder, who is an archaeologist, and his discussion on the entanglement between humans and things. This book is quite important, and many of the people now are influenced by Bruno Latour's Agency of Things. This is Ian Hodder's, who makes a distinction between objects and things, although he points out there are overlaps, but he uses the term things instead of objects, and I'll be using that term as well, things. But the entanglement is what I would like to emphasize today as we look at various monks from China who traveled to India in the 7th century. So There is, of course, Buddhist materiality that people have written about. There is, as you look at various Buddhist teachings, there's a critique of material world, not touching money, and the ways in which you get rid of your property as you become member of the Sangha, Buddhist community. But there are also things that are in service of Buddhism, and I'm thinking about images, text, and so forth, that are very important for the transmission of Buddhism, the practice of Buddhism, and so forth. But there are also things that the Buddhist community uses that are not related to the teaching of Buddhism. And these are daily use things, food stuff, and things that may be quite important as you travel from one place to another. Now, some of the things of the past, not in service of Buddhism, that we use, art historians use, archaeologists use to study the past. I think those are important things. Things, as a historian would say, evidence for a particular topic that we are looking at. And here too, there are some key writings. People would be familiar with John's work, very, very important work on Buddhist materiality, but also Fabio Rambelli's work on, in the case of Japan. And I think very few people know about this book on Sri Lanka, and this is in the case of Theravada Buddhism, and then the use of material culture in Sri Lanka. This is quite an early book, Rope and Plow, I think talks about property owned by Buddhist communities. But these are some of the key works that have inspired me in my work on the issue of materiality in Buddhism. Now, the Buddhist monks that I'm going to talk about are traveling long distance, and much has to be said about the distance itself by these three important monks, Faxian, Xuanzang, and Yijing. Most of you who are taking Sonia's class would know about these monks. Faxian, most likely the first Chinese monk. We don't know if he was the first one to go to India, but he was certainly the one who came back and wrote a travelogue and became an important travelogue for others who were inspired to go to India as well. Xuanzang has two books, and I'll come back to both of these things with regard to my study, my talk today. One is, of course, his own Tatang Si. The other one is the biography. They are both being used to study his travels in South Asia. And the other one, unfortunately, not much looked at, is quite important. Yijing works, third most important Buddhist monk from China to travel. The first one, a record of the inner law sent home from the South Seas, has a good translation by Li Rongxi, who has also translated the other works. The second book, which is the biographies of eminent monks, including Chinese and Korean monks, is actually very, very important with regard to the problems, hazards of travel and so forth. But the translation that exists today is not that good. But I would encourage people to look at this second work of Yijing. Now, the distance part, I mean, these maps I've used previously, it just gives you the distance, you know. I mean, traveling is not easy today, but it was not easy in the 5th century when Faxian traveled, and this is the route that he seems to have taken, going overland, coming back by the sea. These routes were perhaps not known to him that much, but he worked his way out, traveled to India, traveled to Sri Lanka, came back to Southeast Asia. Quite fascinating, and the accomplishment seems to be a lot important looking back at 5th century. Xuanzang, who travels by the land route, comes back by the land route, also quite important. The distance, I would say, is something to keep in mind as you travel from Chang'an to various parts of South Asia. What is it that you are carrying with you? What is it that you're bringing back? I think these are important questions to be asked. Yijing, on the other hand, goes by the sea route, comes back by the sea route, and then his records are very important to understand what's happening, especially in Sumatra, Buddhism in Southeast Asia in particular. He seems to have lived in Srivijaya in Sumatra for some time, writing, translating sutras. So these three monks, I mean, the distance that they travel is quite amazing. The way they traveled, the hazards they encountered, I think we should keep in mind those kinds of basic issues related to travel that these three monks accomplished. So I'll talk some of the things that they had to carry with them as part of today's talk. Just to summarize the logistics and hazards, which again connected to the talk, distance is a great hurdle. We usually forget that when we are reading these travelogues, but I think we need to keep in mind that they are accomplishing something that very few people may have done it in the past. The logistics of transportation, how do you get a horse? How do you travel on a camel? How do you walk? How do you travel on a ship? How do you manage to figure that out? When is the ship sailing? So these are some of the important things to keep in mind. Provisions and cost, I mean, you have to eat, you have to pay the merchant who is perhaps taking you all the way from one place to another. The merchant may be donating the transportation charges for free, but you'll see in some of the records, there's issue about money being carried by monks. The unknown terrains, again, very, very important. And this, if you watch Journey to the West, the fictionalized version, you'll see the unknowns of terrains come in that story more prominently, perhaps, than Xuanzang's own writing. But I think that needs to be kept in mind. They are walking through or riding a horse through or going on a ship through different kinds of terrain, different kinds of climate. I think those are quite important to understand the rigors, logistics, and hazards of long distance. Safety and health issues, very, very important. There are robbers, there are various kinds of diseases. You carry medicine with you. I mean, those are things that a traveler must account for. And this is true of today. That was true also earlier period in the 5th century when Faxian made it. So just to keep those things in mind, I think quite important to understand not only the long distance that was being traveled by these monks, but also what they were carrying to address the distance issue. Now, I pointed out these sources. Now, I would take out Xuanzang's. I mean, people would say this is one of the most important travelogues, but if you look at the logistics of travelogue, this work is not that interesting. Xuanzang has very little to write about how he traveled, what he encountered as part of logistics and hazards. He's writing, as we know, for a particular audience, the ruler of Tang Dynasty, and he's more interested in ethnographic descriptions of Buddhist past rather than his own travelogue. The one that is more interesting, is the biography of Xuanzang. This work is problematic because it is a hagiography. It is both historical and ahistorical, making Xuanzang a hero, but it has a lot of details about travel itself, and that's what I'm going to use instead of Xuanzang's own writing about his travel. Just to mention how I'm going to deal with Xuanzang, looking at the biography rather than his records of the Western regions. Now, many of you perhaps are art historians. Sonia is an art historian, and they may have seen all these paintings of traveling itinerant monks that are quite famous. There are about 12 or 13 of such images that we see. The first one is supposed to be Xuanzang. Dorothy Wong, I don't know if she's in the audience, has used this on the cover of her latest book, but there are other monks, sometimes wrongly said to be Xuanzang, but they are perhaps just monks who are walking. And then these paintings are quite interesting to see what they are actually carrying. And so I think beyond the text, these images themselves, if we see them as things, are important to understand the traveling monks themselves. So not to just identify who they are, but what they are carrying, I think, is quite important. And then this carrying of stuff continues. This is a picture from, I think, 19th century Japan. And you can see the huge, let's say, backpack that the monk is carrying with various kinds of things. He may be storytelling, he may be proselytizing, he may be just carrying various kinds of necessities from one place to another. So we see this continuation of carrying stuff from one place to another by Buddhist monks. And then as they move, these things also get transmitted from one place to another. Let's see. Now here we see, if we look at the details of the Xuanzang painting, you see some of the things that he has, and I would encourage people to look closely at what he is wearing, or as what he is being depicted as having with him, sandals, as he walked from, or he took the horse, it seems, but he may have been carrying an extra pair of sandals made of leather or what. I think that's something we need to think about, look at other perhaps existing sandals that the monks had. He also is carrying certain stuff in his hand. No, that is not a torch in his left hand, but I think he is quite feeling quite hot, and that's why he has to use the kind of thing that he's carrying in his right hand. This thing that perhaps is to address the issue of flies. He also has, oops, I think this is going back. Sorry about that. He also has an umbrella, and he also has a backpack. People have said carrying sutras as he comes back. And people have written about this image and some of the things that he has on his body. And I think that those kinds of studies are quite important to understand that Buddhist monks, when they traveled, carried things with them, stuff with them that were part of the necessities, and not just things that were related to the practice of Buddhism. So these images that art historians have worked on, I think, are quite important contributions to understand the long distance travel and the logistics of long distance travel. So how do we then put this kind of materiality to study travel between China and India? I'm focusing on 3 monks, but there are other monks that travel between China and India. They perhaps have not left detailed travelogue as these 3 have done. There's also a Korean monk, Huichao, who traveled and between India and China from Korea. His work is in fragmented form. There's also a diplomat called Wang Xuanze who also traveled. There are all lots of Indian monks who came to China, and their travels are recorded in different versions in Chinese sources, but I'll focus on these 3 because they are clearly important travelogues. I'll go along with the 3 monks, starting with Faxian, and we have to credit Faxian. If indeed he was the first monk, he contributed enormously to the later views on how perhaps monks should travel, the ways that they should cross the difficult terrain, and where they should go to in South Asia, and what perhaps they might witness. So his contribution is quite important, and in my earlier studies I've pointed out his work was also read by non-Buddhists in China, and perception of India in China was initially constructed by what Faxian had seen and depicted in his travelogue. Let's see. Now, one of the things that shows up clearly in his writing, and I'm taking some of the narratives from his work, and this importance of image. And when did Buddhism come to China? I was just talking to Sonia about this recent discovery of an image from the mid-2nd century that is in the news recently. But here you have also credit to a thing that may have helped the initial transmission of Buddhism. Of course, this is imaginary ways of looking at the earlier when did Buddhism come? And this is when Faxian is asked in India, when was Buddhism introduced into China? And then he is talking about this image of Maitreya, which seems to have come into China, and then other things. So he is emphasizing this importance of image that we see. And I think that's one way of looking at the agency of objects or things in the initial transmission of Buddhism, and it seems Faxian also credits that. The other one, also imaginary, is perhaps this other one that shows up in Dunhuang paintings, the Changqian and Hangwudi bringing and worshipping Buddhist image, perhaps the earliest that we see represented, maybe not historical, but still the importance of image in the transmission of Buddhism. And we see that in Faxian's writing as well as his paintings. So the importance, again, emphasizing of things, images as part of the transmission of Buddhism between China and India. But coming back to the travel itself, procuring daily necessities as they travel is quite important. And as we read some of these travelogues, we tend to miss out on these basic things of travel. And then here we see in his writing how the monks that were traveling with Faxian trying to find stuff that they would perhaps use to sustain themselves. I think those are quite important as well for the journey. And then who is supplying these necessities, the donors? I think these tell us important aspects of the connections between China and India. It was not simple moving of a monk. It was the whole ecosystem of movement that I think we should be thinking about as well. Now, one of the things that is about matter, this is something quite interesting as objects, how they exist or become objects. One thing that Faxian realized as he tried to find sutras is that they did not exist as what he had imagined. They were memorized. And so he was told that, you can't really take the object because it's in my memory. I can recite it for you. So this change from memory of a sutra to the writing down on a paper later on in China, I think is also a very important part of this material ecosystem of the connection between China and India, how sutras recited then become part of the text, so different matter altogether. Now, this is, I think, one of the most fascinating aspects for me because I've been looking at the maritime connections between China and India, and then Faxian, of course, returning by the sea route and gets into trouble traveling both from Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia and from Southeast Asia to China, and then he has to throw things off. So what are the things he had to throw? Pitcher, nobody talks about Buddhist monks carrying a pitcher, right? Wash basin that he had, some other personal articles. What are these articles? This is, I think, very, very important that other than sacred text and images that we would imagine he would be carrying, Xuanzang does that, Yijing does that, but pitcher, wash basin, personal items, I think these are also important things to look at and should not be neglected as part of these long distance connections. So what these things look like, this is a ritual wash basin, and then it's a pitcher. Maybe they look like this, we don't have any idea, but these are some of the items for daily use purposes that Faxian was carrying. What's their agency, what role they play? I think these are important questions to ask as we look at long distance connections created by these monks. Xuanzang, using his biography, is also quite interesting. As he goes from Central Asia, he needs letters of introduction. I think this is the time, or just past the time when students are asking us to write recommendation letters. But letters written on what? Paper, most likely in Central Asia. But he's carrying it, right? Xuanzang, if you remember, he did not get permission to leave Tang, China, and so he needed this kind of recommendation letter so that people can provide him various kinds of passages, necessities, and so forth. He seems to be also having attendants to help him. More than 50 articles that he is carrying, right? Robes, cotton hats, fur blankets, boots, stockings, rolls of silk, satin, gold and silver money. You see the traveling expenses here to sustain 20 years. I mean, it seems that he has been given too much stuff to carry, but these are important things to keep in mind that he's carrying with you. Again, in the study of Xuanzang, if you bring these aspects into our study of him traveling, I think it'll be quite fascinating to understand it was not easy. And there were all these things that perhaps we have missed in our previous studies of Xuanzang. When he comes back, and I think this is a fascinating, again, this is from biography, and we have to take things a pinch of salt about what's in the biography, but he seems to have brought several hundred articles from the Western regions, many from India, and there's a list, and on this list is quite amazing. And I'll point out that Dorothy Wong has looked at some of these objects, but the last sentence here, total of 657 books bound in 520 bundles and carried back on 20 horses, just quite amazing. And the logistics of it must have been really crazy. How did he manage it? Well, we know that he did not manage it quite well because 50 bundles of whatever he was bringing, and flower seeds were lost because the elephant sank in the river. And so as you travel, as you carry things, things get lost. And then I think we should also account for things that get lost. If Faxian threw his water basin away, that's lost, right? But I think this is quite amazing, the difficulties of carrying things from one place to another. Many times you are not successful in bringing things. And I would say, again, how many people have looked at these flower seeds? Why was he bringing these flower seeds? I think it will be interesting to see what we think about this kind of transmission of flowers and plants that took place. We think about tea later on being transported from China to India. But what was Xuanzang doing, bringing these flower seeds, would be amazing to look at. Now let me just point out that one of the things he also does very importantly is the translation of work. And so he's transferring Indic languages, Indic script into Chinese languages. Most likely, since paper did not exist in India at that time, there is also a transfer of the medium on which these Buddhist texts were written, palm leaves to paper. I think those are also important things to study as we look at the importance of long distance in the materiality of China-India connections, how things get transferred as they move from one place to another, something anthropologists have also pointed out. Things in the long durée change, and that's something we need to also focus on. Finally, Yijing, right? And Yijing for me is the most interesting of the three, given the detailed aspects of travel that he writes about, right? And then he points out, according to various kinds of Vinaya, what a traveling monk needs to carry. Here you see, carries the bottle, alms bowl, of course, personal robes, and then how they cover their body, umbrella. So this is, for me, quite fascinating about telling us how a monk should actually travel and what are the things they should be carrying. And then one of the other things his book on the comparative practice of Buddhism in China and India is really very, very important for those of us who do China, India, is what is done in India, what is done in China. This is perhaps the earliest comparative study of China and India by Yijing. And then he points out here, the way in which Indian monks would wear their robes would be different. And this kind of confusion and perhaps changes that happen in the course of transmission, I think quite important to understand as things, ideas, people moved. They did not remain the same. I think that's important to take away, that things change, emphasizing that again. The biographies talks about very, very interesting monks, less known in our studies, but he talks about this very interesting fact where carrying or smuggling of a tooth relic from Sri Lanka fails. Smuggler monk who tried to steal the tooth relic from Sri Lanka and fails, but that's something not mentioned in many other sources. But then in the very last stages of his travel, and this is again fascinating, paper and ink, we think of them as granted, but Southeast Asia, Sumatra, perhaps he did not have. paper in particular. So he is trying to get paper from China, and he gets into the ship to ask somebody to get it. The ship sails, and he ends up back in China, not intended to be back. So these kinds of unscheduled travel is quite fascinating as well. So I think what we get from these sources are the various complex logistics of travel. And one of the things I had problems with, people seeing China and India as given entities, not realizing, going between the two places is not easy. It's complex for humans and also things, right? So these are some of the issues that comes up in Yijing's second book, which I would say is quite fascinating to understand the travel that took place. Yijing, again, for me is quite important because he creates this kinds of glossary of Sanskrit words and their rendition into Chinese as an artifact itself. Is quite important for me to study this this glossary, not just as to study the language, but also as an object as well. I will not talk about this today, but I think this is something that needs to be worked on as well. Now, finally, I'll just end with this section with things that have survived during the course of travel. Now, we of course have the texts, and so on the left of your screen is Faxian's text, his travelogue. On the right is perhaps one of the earliest editions, manuscripts that we have of Xuanzang. So the texts themselves as objects have survived. I think these are quite important. I'll come and talk about Xuanzang's own text and how important it was for the later generations. But the objects that he brought back, what happened to them? So there's this in Chinese for those of you who read. The big goose or the great goose pagoda in Xi'an may have had some of these objects kept there. Dorothy Wong has written about the long durée impact of these items, what she calls the international Buddhist style, originating in some of the objects that Xuanzang may have brought. So her chapter on that kind of international broader impact of the items brought by Xuanzang, I think it's quite important to understand the agency of objects. If we can just remove the agency of Xuanzang, but just look at the objects, I think that will be really good. The other thing that has survived that fewer people have worked on, and this is about monks that we don't know much about. There are two Chinese Buddhist inscriptions in Bodh Gaya written by Chinese monks who went there during the Sung dynasty. Well, these are important artifacts. This has been translated a long time ago by Beale. But again, these are material remain of the long distance travel and beyond the travelogue that we have to study the connections and the travels between China and India. So this has survived as evidence of long distance travel. So you have texts, you have inscriptions that have survived. You also have the monk himself who has survived in a different form. And I think this is a fascinating aspect of studying the afterlife of Xuanzang. So 1943 is when his remains were discovered in Nanjing. That's on the top left corner is the Japanese troops who were discovering this relic. It was then distributed. One of them ended up in India, Dalai Lama presenting it to Nehru. But it is quite an important artifact in the long durée, I would say, connections between China and India, with the monk coming back to India. This is part of something I wrote in my book as well, the circulatory history, where things come back in different form. And this is Xuanzang for me coming back in different form, in different matter, and so forth. Now, we also see the impact of his writings in Japan. This is a famous scroll from Japan in the 14th century, where his travelogue is then put into an illustration form. And I think that's a fascinating aspect of how objects then get transformed into different things, images with different style. Certainly, this is Xuanzang in Nalanda, and this scroll itself has been studied by a number of people. Also, part of this travelogue and their changes as material object is how knowledge is transmitted. And then here we have a map of India, the 5 Indias, also from the 14th century, based on the travel of Xuanzang. So you can see the impact of this travel and the different forms it's assuming as Xuanzang goes back to India, writes it, and then it gets depicted by the Japanese, and then his own relic comes back to India. I think this is a fascinating long distance travel in the long durate. Xuanzang's travel is still continuing in a way through these objects and as his bodily remains. And of course, we know that the story itself was changed into a fictionalized version, Journey to the West. Recently, there was a movie that was made as part of China-India collaboration, the Tatang Shenzhang. Quite nicely done. The filming of it is quite fascinating. And the star Hong Xiaoming actually learned a little bit of Hindi and Sanskrit. Nobody spoke Hindi at that time anyway, but if you have not watched the film, I would recommend doing that. So I'll conclude with this slide and then open up for Q&A. Again, thinking with things. I think it's important to study the experience of travel through the objects and not just the writing of the monks. So as you reread the travelogues, I would encourage you to look at the logistics of travel. I think because these are the things that actually made travel possible, including ships, horses, camels, those things that are, when Ian Hodder points out how animals are also things with agency. Role of things in shaping interactions between China and I think this is tremendously important. And I've been looking at the 1950s. I find the same issues about how things were very, very important in the interactions between China and India. And then this human thing, entanglement is something that is related to the transmission of Buddhism, but more broadly, intra-regional interactions. And that's why I think just moving beyond humans and looking at their connections to things. It can be anything connected to the transmission of Buddhist religion, not connected to it. What it does ultimately, and this is something I've argued in my JS article on the state of China-India studies, is ultimately we need interdisciplinary framework to study the connections between China and India. It cannot be just Buddhism. It has to be material culture. It has to be trade. It seems that all these things come in and then we have to go beyond our comfort zones of disciplinary training and to look at other ways in which people, regions interacted. And so that's the pitch I'll make for your students, Sonia, and I'll end with that and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Well, thank you so much. You have given us so much to think about. And now let's see what questions we have. Looks like some of the students have typed the questions. Maybe it's better I let them speak. So I'm trying to unmute, let them speak. So I think Anna has the first question, so I will allow her to speak. Anna, are you there?
Yes, hi. And thank you so much for being here. This was a wonderful presentation and I'm super intrigued by your research. My question actually comes from the chapter that we read before today's talk, Yijing and the Buddhist cosmopolis of the 7th century. I was really intrigued by how much of Yijing's journey was carried out, to paraphrase your description, hitchhiking with merchant groups. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how monks and merchants understood and influenced each other on these shared trips. You mentioned a bit earlier in the talk the sort of notion of either payment or perhaps monks being carried, I don't know, as a voluntary service.
Yeah, so I think it was a complicated relationship, as you see from Faxian's travel. They just wanted to throw him out of the ship because he was not perhaps the religion that the merchants were practicing. So I would say it's a complicated relationship. What you see in Yijing perhaps was not the same as you see in Faxian. And this kind of relationship existed in Central Asia as well as the maritime routes. I would say there is an interdependence, and this is something I wrote in my first book about how Buddhist monks usually provide spiritual support to the merchants. Merchants trying to make profit, traveling on hazardous routes, need that kind of spiritual support. And usually they don't care what kind of spiritual support. They don't differentiate between Buddhism, Hinduism, or whatever religion that they believe in, as long as they can safely travel from one place to another. So some merchant groups would see, as you were pointing out, as an act of supporting the religious cause, whatever religion that it may be, and perhaps eventually traveling safely from one place to another. And the monks then also being necessarily using the transportation. I think the transportation aspect is quite important. How do you travel? Where do you get your horses or camels? Usually in Central Asia, it would be caravans that monks would travel with, because traveling alone may be hazardous as well. But if you are traveling by the sea, you have to use a ship, right? And you can't travel on a boat that you make from China to India or back. So it's imperative that you travel on a ship that is going. And then here, the logistics of traveling on a ship is quite interesting, because if you look at Indian Ocean, you can't travel any time of the year because of the monsoon winds. Before the steamships came in, you had to leave India certain months of the year. You have to leave China during the certain months of the year, because you want to have the monsoon winds behind you and not in front of you. So that would require a huge number of logistics of trying to figure out when exactly would you leave, and then which ship. And then some merchants maybe would be willing to provide free passage. Others perhaps would ask money. And again, I would say it's quite neglected part of studies is how merchants and monks traveling long distance negotiated that, right? And then it comes in many different sources. I didn't talk about nuns. There are records of nuns traveling, for example, from Sri Lanka to China on merchant ships, and how they negotiate their travel. I think it's quite fascinating. So I would say there were different ways in which the relationship was understood, different ways they influenced each other. So if you just compare Faxian's experience on the ship and how some of his fellow travelers thought that he was the problem, the ship was encountering storms and wanting to throw him out, to what Yijing experiences traveling from China to Southeast Asia and from Southeast Asia to India. So I think those are fascinating ways in which you can compare the necessity of interacting and the logistics of interacting with the merchants or between merchants and monks.
Great. Wow, this is very informative. Now, turning to the next question, that's from Sue. So I'm allowing you to talk. You have a lot of questions.
Hi, thank you. No, I'll just add one. I'll just ask one of them. Thank you, Dr. Sen, for your talk. You ended by looking at things that survive in your final section, and I was interested about that in context of your brief discussion of the three Vijayans in both your book and your Yijing article, because you talk about them as this important maritime polity in the transmission of Buddhism. But there's obviously little of their material culture left in general, and very little of their maritime material culture left. So in regards to this and your own work on roots and stops, I was wondering how you work to balance the information between entities that have more extant physical material left versus those that don't. Or kind of to be more blunt, how do you avoid privileging the culture that does have more material in your understanding of the historical past? In both your own work and how you see that, I guess, maybe in the field itself.
Well, actually, there's a lot of material from Srivijaya. There's a Musi River near Palembang where they are finding fascinating things. I would suggest that you Google search Musi River, Palembang, and some of the artifacts. Unfortunately, many of these artifacts are being smuggled out instead of curated in museums or studied. And they would reveal various kinds of connections that existed between Sumatra and China on one hand, Sumatra and India on the other hand. So I would say what exists with regard to Srivijaya is actually material culture rather than textual details. So for example, we do not know exactly what the capital of Srivijaya was, and was Srivijaya a single polity or made up of many different polities. So those are the things that are still being debated with regard to the nature of the Srivijayan polity. But I think there are various kinds of inscriptions, artifacts from Sumatra, but also from China. And I have looked at Srivijaya not only during the Tang, but also its manifestation during the Sung, because it becomes an important player in international trade, and their embassies visiting Sung China. And Guangzhou has one inscription that was left behind by one of the diplomats. But I would say that, in fact, there are lots of material remains from Palembang that have yet to be studied, unfortunately. One of the things that we don't know much about is about Southeast Asian Buddhism, the early phase in particular. And here, instead of Srivijaya, the other part that is quite important is Kedah, which is in present-day Malaysia. Some of the earliest evidence of Buddhist artifacts are found from Kedah. And I would say those are, I mean, if you are looking at to go beyond China and India, I would say Sumatra is a very interesting place to look at the material remains. And the first inscription that we know of from Kedah about a merchant donating things to the Buddhist community is quite fascinating. So I would say, yeah, just Google and you'll find lots of material remains. And I hope Sonia will help you look at those artifacts as well, because the Silk Road has another manifestation, so-called the maritime Silk Road, and the things that we find in Sumatra are important to study the maritime connections.
Thank you.
Great. Actually, there are quite a few questions. So Lauren is next. So I will unmute you, and so you can ask your question about money and payment.
Hi there. So as I wrote in my question, and as Professor Lee stated at the beginning of this talk, we also read from your book, India, China, and the World. And in it, you introduced this idea of alternative payment methods. And I just wanted to ask you about that because we've been talking today about the logistical practicalities of how these journeys worked. So in your book, you specifically mentioned the tributary system. So how would that have played out practically in this idea of monks needing money and dealing with merchants and stuff like that? What would they get instead of money sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, so you know, the exchange was not like what we have today with regard to payment, right? I mean, it would be more of a barter, exchanging one commodity for the other, and that's how perhaps it took place. But you know, gifts were given to Buddhist monks, and then perhaps they did not use it, and they perhaps then sold it. Because you needed to sustain the monastic community with money. You had to buy stuff. And then we see that in various monastic institutions in South Asia and China, how using the donations, including donations of money, is then being used. Some is to sustain their daily livelihood in a monastic community, but some of the monastic institutions also became important money lenders. So they would give money to merchants, invest in merchant endeavors, right? So this is the money part of this complex relationship, that different ways in which money worked. But you know, there is of course exchange in artifacts only that does not involve currency or money. And the tribute system is something that the Chinese state had created, where usually there were merchants who would come and bring some kind of so-called tribute to recognize the Chinese emperor as the emperor of the world. But many of these tribute carriers were actually merchants. And what I found during the Sung dynasty, where there were many Buddhist monks who were coming as tribute carriers. And I suspect they were doing it as to avoid taxes. They were most likely merchants disguised as monks, and using the tribute system to make money. So yeah, I don't think monks themselves would be paying tribute. And this relates to a very interesting relationship between the state and the monks. And if you have done Chinese Buddhism, you would know that one of the difficulties Chinese Buddhists faced is how did they interact with the state and the emperor. And this is something many of the travelers would say, in India, the rulers bow down to the monks, but in China, monks are not supposed to be bowed down by the rulers. So I think the material culture of that was quite different. And tribute system was occasionally, whenever they appeared, they were mostly merchants disguised as monks.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is about something quite different. So we'll allow Di Wang to speak.
Hi, Professor Sun. Thank you so much for the talk today. Professor Robert Scharf, in his Coming to Terms with Chinese Buddhism, has argued that when we talk about introduction and the transmission of Buddhism in China, in East Asia, and even in Asia, we always use the term of syncretism and dialogue. But according to him, that the problem is that the category of syncretism presupposes the existence of a distinctive religious entity that predicts such dialogue or syncretism. And thus, a pure Buddhism is little more than an analytic abstraction posited by Buddhist practitioners and reformers and scholars. Do you agree to his argument? And do you think the study of the materiality of long distance traveling in medieval Indo-Chinese world further support this argument, or it will provide a different perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with many of Bob Scharf's arguments. And then, if you look at Yijing's work, you'll see the complexity of this aspect, because he is comparing the practice of Buddhism in China and India, and you see lots of differences. And then he tries to tell the readers that, okay, given the different situation in China, it is okay to use chopsticks when the Indians don't have any knowledge about chopsticks. So I think the syncretic part and the differences are quite fascinating. You can't replace the model in India elsewhere. I mean, as you look at, Xuanzang tried to do that and failed to replicate various kinds of teachings in India, in China. But so I would say it's more complex issues about the transmission of Buddhism. And the material culture does tell us that it was quite diverse and complex, right? I mean, how do you use something? How do you live your life in a monastic institution, right? How do you live a life as a lay Buddhist, right? So clearly what we see, and this is again, Yijing pointed out about how do you wear a robe. And then he points out, although Chinese were mistakenly wearing their robes, not according to the ways the Indian monks did. And Xuanzang tried to rectify that and did not succeed, right? So I think this issue about syncretism, syncretization are all there. I mean, there's a complexity of practicing a religion which is not as fixed as, let's say, Brahmanism or even Christianity, right? And I would say the fluid nature of Buddhism itself allows things to be modified, changed, and practiced very differently. And I think that's how perhaps we should look at, and I call now Buddhisms with an S, because it's quite different. And that's perhaps is the way to do the study of Buddhisms in different parts of region. So if you look at Buddhisms in China, because China as an entity was not the same as what we have today, what's practiced in Yunnan, Tibet, Xinjiang, other parts of China, quite different, right? Is there syncretism among all these Buddhisms in PRC? I think that's something to work on as well. I don't know if that answers your question. If you want a follow-up, you can do so. But I think that's an important way of looking at Buddhism.
Oh no, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
All right, so now we're going a different direction with the next question, and that's from Catherine. So I will unmute you and you can speak.
Hi, Professor Sen. Thank you for your talk. My question is drawn from what you were talking about in the Yijing chapter about the sort of circulation of knowledge among monks about travel logistics. And we focused on these travel accounts from famous monks, but I'm wondering if you have other textual sources. Is there anything that sort of comes to resemble what we might call like a modern guidebook to travel?
From that period, unfortunately, no. These three are the most detailed one. I mentioned Hecho, the Korean monk, who also wrote, and this is should have been quite important because his writing is from the 8th century, and lots is happening in the 8th century, but his record survives only in fragments. He traveled by the sea route and came back by the land route opposite of Faxian, and so that exists. And I don't think much work has been done on that. There's a recent study of Hecho's travelogue that you can find on Amazon, which is good, highlighting the importance of his writing. Max Deeg, who is in Cardiff, has written a number of things about Hecho as well. But so that would be one additional material. Unfortunately, we don't have anything about Indian monks traveling. Nothing in Indic languages to China, right? But we do find fragments of their travels in Chinese sources, right? So for example, there's this esoteric monk called Amoga Vajra, who originally went to China, but then he also travels later on to Sri Lanka and comes back, right? So we find some of his travels in Chinese sources, but we would not designate these as travelogues, right? As we see in the case of Faxian, Xuanzang, and Yijing. The other thing that we totally lack is study of nuns traveling, right? And I think it has become such a male-dominated study of China and India, and I wish some of you might want to look at what happened when women traveled, and since all the questions were asked by female students of Sonia, I think you would realize that logistics are quite different than Yijing traveling or Xuanzang traveling. I think in order to have a proper understanding of these long distance connections, you can't leave out one gender out of the studies. And so I would highly encourage, if you are going into graduate school or doing your PhD, to look at the gender aspect of long distance travel and long distance connections between China and India. And that's why my recent work is actually on a female traveler from India in 1949, who is perhaps the first Indian to come to PRC in December 1949. And her travelogue is perhaps not done, but so we find female travelogues from the Indian side in the 20th century, and I wanted to bring that gender perspective through that, because now we have travelogues by women writers. But yeah, I think there's a lack of similar kind of travelogue that we have from the 7th century.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Eleanor, so I will let her speak.
Hello, thank you so much for talking with us today and giving us your fascinating presentation. I unfortunately, I feel like you slightly answered a bit of my question in the last question, so apologize for the overlap. But you mentioned in your article on Yijing, and then also a little bit, I believe, in the book, that by at least around Yijing's time, there was this, it had sort of been accepted among Indian monks that China was a really important part of the Buddhist cosmopolis, and that, for instance, Mount Wutai was accepted as the dwelling place of Manjushri, and therefore there were Indian monks who traveled to China to Mount Wutai on pilgrimage. And I sort of like the flip side to these Chinese travelogues, I was sort of wondering what you might be able to tell me about the routes that these Indian monks were taking, and what they were taking with them, or if they took things back when they went back to India.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, I wrote one of my chapters in the first book is about this, how Wutai emerged as the center of Buddhist transmission by the time Yijing visited India. I mean, that's I think the fascinating part of this long distance connection between China and India. I mean, you have to think about the state of Buddhism in different parts of South Asia, where there's a deurbanization taking place, deurbanization where cities that were initially supporting the Buddhist Sangha, the communities, they decline. And Xuanzang also mentioned this facet of declining monastic institutions along the various trade routes. And what emerges at that time is this Wutai as a place where Manjushri would emerge. And then this seems to have spread so rapidly in the Buddhist world that it attracted Indian monks who were also encountering this declining part of Buddhism in India. And then they thought that, if you want to be in the presence of Manjushri, you have to travel to Mount Wutai, right? Now, there are various kinds of material things that survive with regard to that travel. There are various kinds of records about the visiting of Indian monks, for example, to Wutai. In my first book, I also mentioned this maybe also in this India, China, and the World book, about this language learning that the Indian monks were doing in Khotan. So there is a Khotanese Chinese Sanskrit kind of learning textbook that what would you say that I'm going to China. So it seems that although we don't have a nice written travelogue about these Indian monks, but we can see various kinds of evidence about what they were doing. So if it was done in Khotan, this language learning book, then these monks were going through Khotan, right? So that's one thing. They are going through Central Asia, and I would suspect some of these monks are also going by the sea route, and some may be going through Tibet, because Tibet becomes one of the important routes through which monks are traveling. And also, again, in the first book, I talk about the paintings that have survived about Indian monks going to China. And they were going through Nepal. Nepal is actually a very important place for the veneration of Manjushri. So what they were taking, we don't know. They may be taking various kinds of donations and so forth, but they were bringing back mementos, images, paintings, and this we see again in the paintings that seems to have been produced in Mount Wutai. And as any travelers would do, you bring back mementos, and it seems that they were bringing that back as well. And again, I write this as part of object exchange in my first book, that Tibetans were asking for. Again, Mount Wutai becomes very important for the Tibetans during the Qing dynasty, for example. So you have these kinds of things going out from China to South Asia, these kinds of images. And Yijing is really reflecting on that monks in India know about the story of Manjushri in Wutai. So I think that's a fascinating, I call it the reverse transmission of Buddhism, where you see the Buddhist ideas produced in China makes it back to South Asia. And so in some of my writings, I've challenged this notion about the transmission of Buddhism being unidirectional from South Asia to China. But this is one example where we see things created in China coming back to South Asia. And the veneration of Manjushri is clearly one of the most important ones.
Yes, it was really fascinating to me when I saw it there. I was excited about it. So thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I would also add that in Tibet, it's Chang Buddhism made it there, and it's also a pretty interesting two-way traffic. Okay, so now let's turn to Lena, who has the next question, and please speak.
Thank you so much, Professor. I really enjoyed your wonderful presentation. Especially in your final part, you raised the important aspect of doing the intra-regional studies. So I wish to ask this question if we want to do a comparative studies of intra-regional studies, first between like in East Asia sphere versus those in South Asian sphere. Do you see if the differences of language play a role here? Because some scholars such as Holcomer argues since China, Korea, and Japan in pre-modern times shared a common writing kanji system, so that language commonality played an important role in terms of the ways and the things are exchanged. But the things are different compared with when it comes to the exchanges between China and India in pre-modern times. So I'm curious and would like to know more if you can elaborate a little bit more about if you think the language differences or maybe language barrier played a role here and cause any differences if we do such comparative studies of intra-regional studies. Thank you.
I would highly encourage you to do that. I talked about long distance travel between China and India, but you can do Japan and China. I mean, there are lots of travelogues. And in, for example, went to Tang Dynasty from Japan, and his travelogues are quite important. Jojin was somebody who goes later on as well. I mean, going to Utaishan actually. And so you can do those kinds of travelogues, the travelogues of Chinese monks going to India compared to travelogues of Japanese monks coming to China, and then see what kind of material culture is being discussed. You'll see various kinds. We looked at the letters of introduction, but you needed permission to get into China, for example, how some of these monks were getting those. But yeah, I also in my first book, I argued that by the time Utaishan becomes an important site of veneration, what's happening to the Buddhist world is that it's being divided into different, let's say, smaller worlds. And what you are pointing out, the China-focused world that connects Korea, Japan, and Chang'an into one region or sub-region, you can say. Later on during Sung period, you will have the Khitans and the Tanguts having a very fascinating region of their own, right? And then in South Asia, you would have India and Tibet, for example, Northern India and Tibet having their own kind of circulation that overlaps a little bit with Tibet and China. But then there's also a Theravada, if you want to use that word, between Sri Lanka, Burma, and Southeast Asia. So you have many different centers of Buddhism that emerges the 8th, 9th centuries. And languages are different. The material cultures are different. And this is why we are thinking about doing a series of conferences or workshops on this notion of Buddhist cosmopolis. There's certainly multiple Buddhist cosmopolis, right? I mean, so if you look at the connections between Sri Lanka, Burma, and Southeast Asia, extending to Thailand, I think it's a fascinating thing that you can compare with what you are pointing out that Holcomb has talked about, the China, Japan, Korea. And I would say, don't forget the nomadic or the semi-nomadic people. Sisya, for example, Buddhism and Sisya, there are recent writings about Buddhism and Sisya, which I think are quite important. Same with I think the Liao Buddhism are quite fascinating. So we can't just think about the states that currently exist and forget these semi-nomadic tribes that existed, and maybe used Buddhism as their identity purposes, state identities. So I think comparative studies are quite important, and I would highly encourage you to start by comparing the travelogues, let's say by Enin and Xuanzang. See how, for example, you can see the differences in travel and the material culture.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to know there are so many fascinating new topics to be explored in regional studies as an emerging field. Thank you.
Okay, great. Now we have question from Zumi, so I will let her speak.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today, Dr. Sen. So my question is that in regard to the Buddhist cosmopolis that you mentioned in your article, it seems to be that you define it as a loose, transcontinental, heterogeneous community constructed by shared beliefs, which is Buddhism. And it seems like it really indicates a lively cultural exchanges between many regions. But I guess I was wondering, do we have any textual sources that can inform us how fast and actively these Buddhist teachings and material culture were circulated and implemented during this time period within the community? Or is it a more of an individual case that we have to take it one-on-one differently? Or so would you say this this type of circulation drastically slowed down after the 7th century?
No, it actually increases. So I would say, so I'm borrowing this idea of Buddhist cosmopolis from the world system historians who talk about sub-world systems where various kinds of languages, cultures, and artifacts create a world or worlds onto themselves. And so in a similar model, what I see is after the 7th century, starting with the 7th century, I would say, you see this kinds of various kinds of zones or cosmopolis emerging throughout the Buddhist world. So yeah, and I would say that they are very fluid. They are loose, as you point out, and the movement is multi-directional. I think that's the most important part. It's not unidirectional. It's moving back and forth between Japan and China, China and Japan, Korea, Liao, and Sung China. So I think what emerges is different kinds of interactions, complex interactions. I would say each of them need to be studied separately before we look at the larger picture, because I think we need to do justice to those kinds of interactions that existed within that kind of, let's say, geographical space that's taking place. And then they may emphasize one form of Buddhism over other. Sonia just mentioned the existence of Chan in Tibet. But that also gets linked to Persia and Iran, the Ilkhanate during the Mongol times. There's lots of interesting connections between Tibet and Iran, and perhaps the biography of the Buddha that emerges in the Islamic Persian tradition relates to the connection with Tibet and northern India. So there are many different ways in which you can then look at this really very interesting world of Buddhism post 7th century, and our idea of doing the workshops on Buddhist cosmopolis was to look at each of these separately and see what are the interesting factors bringing these places together. Is it one Buddhist doctrine, one Buddhist text, one Buddhist belief, or perhaps the circuit by transportation? So yes, so I think that's what I would say in the study of Buddhism. Maybe that's what we have to look at as a future development of the field.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I do have a few questions from the general audience. I think some of the questions overlap with what has been asked, but this one has not been discussed. So that's a question about the posthumous spiritual legacy of the Chinese pilgrims. Do you know any examples of them being venerated as Buddhist saints and deity? So I think it's really about the relics from these monks.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Xuanzang is a good example where his relics are being worshipped. But you know, in the case of Chinese religion, many historical figures then are deified and worshipped. Right? And I think Xuanzang's pawn would be the most important one. And many times, if you go to India, this is in Nalanda where the memorial was created and his relic housed. Yes, Xuanzang is venerated, and I think you see these cases with let's say the person I'm working on now, Zheng He. Zheng He is venerated in Southeast Asia, for example. So yeah, Yijing I don't know, Faxian I don't think so, but Xuanzang is a different figure. But you know, Huineng is quite popular in Chan Buddhism in Guangdong region. His body is now mummified and he is being venerated, right? So there are cases, you don't have to be a long distance traveler, but if you are a monk, especially in Guangdong, if you do Guangdong Buddhism, you see there are deified images of historical figures. And if you are interested in looking at one of the articles that I wrote about the connection between Buddhism and migration, where I focus on this Huineng cult and its impact on a specific site in Guangdong. It's called Sihui, not far from Zhaoqing, about how when people migrated from this region in the 18th century, they took this concept of venerating local Buddhas. These are two Buddhas that emerged in the very local site and then moved to Malaysia, and from Malaysia to Calcutta in India. And that perhaps would answer your question that yes, historical figures, monks were venerated, are still being venerated. So if you look at Huineng, I think that's the most important example of a monk being venerated.
Okay, great. There's some questions from a member of the audience about Kidan in Malaysia. So this person would like to know if there's any objects there that are actually being recorded in written works.
You mean Kedah? Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of work done on Kedah, and you know, there's an inscription that is supposed to be called, I mean, it's called the Buddha Gupta inscription, which is perhaps the earliest evidence of Buddhism 5th century in written form that exists. And yeah, there are lots of studies that have been found in that region in Kedah, around Kedah, and other parts of Sumatra that are quite important. But it's also fascinating to see what Faxian says when he reaches Southeast Asia, most likely Sumatra, that he says Buddhism is not practiced here. So there's something interesting going on, and archaeology is perhaps the most important part of the studies that we need to do. I wrote an article about Southeast Asia between China and India, looking at its role both as a place of Buddhism and also trade. What I found very interesting is Buddhism to Southeast Asia not just came from India, but also came from China. And so that usually I mean, this is the whole argument I am trying to make, that it's not a unidirectional transmission of Buddhism from India to other parts. China plays a very important role in early transmission of Buddhism to Southeast Asia as well. Later on, we find China also plays a very important role in the spread of Islam to Southeast Asia. So I think we should not just be looking at movement of things from the west to east, but there are certainly movement from east to west, and that's the reason why I wrote that article on the 18th, 19th century transmission of Buddhism or Buddhist beliefs from Guangdong to Southeast Asia and to India.
Yes, it's certainly fascinating that to really look at how they actually entangle it, to use a word, that it's just not like one-way traffic at all. So we are coming very close to the end of today's event. So I would just like to thank you for providing such a fascinating talk and also being so patient for answering all these questions. We're just bombarding you with so many today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonia, for inviting me, and thank you to all of your students who are so interested in the topic. Feel free to write to me if you have further questions or want to discuss anything. But I hope some of you will go on, and these are all undergraduates, right, Sonia?
No, I think some of the, no, a lot of them are graduate students.
Oh, okay, good. So I expect lots of good theses from you soon, and I would be happy to learn more about what you are finding. And please, if you come and write something very, very interesting, please share with me. I mean, it's always a learning process. So I look forward to your writings as well.
Such an exemplary of two-way traffic. Yes,
Yeah,
that's the
exactly.
exchange. So I would also like to thank the audience. Many of them have stayed for an hour and a half, a very long and rich discussion. So I thank you all. And so we will have to wrap things up soon. And so good night and take care, everybody.